She works in philosophy of language and mind, among other things. She's been writing extensively on figurative language, so she's the expert on metaphor and irony and sarcasm, and also pejoratives, slurs. She's been developing a theory of perspectives and characterizations, mental frames, conceptual maps, and she's done a lot to move the field forward on semantics, pragmatics debates. And today, so she'll be speaking about just kidding. So the floor is yours.
All right, thank you. So yeah, I was just saying to Mihail, thanks so much for putting this whole thing together, and I've enjoyed it so far, and I'm looking forward to as much of it as I can get to. To deal with the abyss of Zoom, I have developed two things that I like to do. So one is I am an opponent of screen sharing. So that's why I mean, everybody else, you can do it. It's totally fine, but it doesn't work well for me. So that's why I've got a handout, but the handout it's in the chat. So you're going to need the handout, but I'd like you to access it on your own device. And, at least it's enough when we got, if a couple more people turned on their cameras, that would be great. But just so I can see some people instead of seeing my own handout, that is super helpful for me to otherwise I just start, oh, look, hi, Karen. Thanks. So that's good. So I just, I feel like I've got some people here. So then the other thing is that I'd like to, this talk has basically has 3 sections, but 2 main sections. So I'd like to pause after the first main section just to have a quick, 5 minutes, a couple questions or something, just so I can get it's less like I'm just shouting into a void for an hour, whatever. So just those are my 2 ways of trying to have some contact here. Okay, so let me just say a little bit about this talk and where it's come from and maybe where it's headed. So, I've been working on sort of weird, somewhat antagonistic forms of speech for quite a while, certainly before 2016, and insinuation and metaphorical insults and sarcasm and slurs. And when the first time I gave sort of this version of this talk was, early February 2017, right after Trump had been elected, and I had this great list I used my taxonomy to analyze these things he was doing with language, and I felt really proud of myself for having a theoretical tool that seemed to slot in so well to our political reality. And I was just looking back at that talk, and I was like, wow, it's all true. It's all he was already doing all of it. It was all super clear. It was all, Then I moved away from really focusing on Trump's speech in the intervening few years, partly because I wanted to be clear this is a really broad phenomenon. And then also because I was giving the talk in places where, I didn't want to alienate my audience by assuming that, by presenting myself as assuming that I had certain kinds of political assumptions or from the get-go. But I thought for today, I wanted to return to really talking about a whole bunch of examples involving Trump because I think they are super illustrative. But again, I do want to, and because I think that I've been thinking of, in the last few weeks, especially about these issues in those terms. And I think that thinking about Trump in particular helps to highlight some of the theoretical issues that I'm really interested in. But I want to, again, emphasize that it's the breadth, the full range of the ways in which these phenomena get used that I'm interested in. So what I'm interested in is forms of accountability avoiding meaning, ways of talking that make it difficult to hold speakers to account, that are designed to make it difficult to hold the speaker to account in our standard ways. And especially those that, well, let me just leave it there. This is not an exhaustive list. This is just sort of some categories that I think are especially powerful and useful. So what I'm going to do now is go through the examples on the first page of the handout and say a little bit about how I think each of those are working. So I think that I want to identify sort of 3 big categories of ways in which speakers avoid the kind of overt explicit commitment that is canonically associated with assertion, and yet communicates successfully. So the first class I'm calling the sort of just saying kind of class, right? So in these cases, the speaker says something which is itself innocuous, is itself a sort of safe, I'm just saying this, how could you deny that? But they communicate something which is more risky, more, insidious. Well, I shouldn't say insidious. So first classic example, this is, purportedly said by Henry II. This is how Shakespeare has Henry II saying this, what miserable drones and traitors have I nourished and brought, so in the class of just saying, the first class of, or subspecies I want to talk about is insinuation, right? So these are cases where you insinuate some content, but you communicate something, but without putting it on record. So the classic case of this is Henry II. He says, what miserable drones and traitors have I nourished and brought up in my house, who let their lord be treated with such shameful contempt by a low-born cleric. He's just asking a question. He is, observing something about certain power dynamics that he thinks are in place, but it was interpreted as basically a command to go and assassinate Thomas Becket. Right, so there's which was a bad thing because he was the Archbishop of Canterbury and so a religious figure. There's an imperative is communicated off record, but it's important that that happens off record so that he can't be held liable for, even though he's the king, he still can't be held. It would be dangerous for him to be held liable for an overt command to assassinate the Archbishop. Second case of insinuation is a case, this is a classic mobster case. This is, I found this in the Ludington, Michigan, I didn't find it from this, but it is in the Ludington, Michigan Daily News from 1926. So here are some questions. How are your children now? You think a lot of them, don't you? You have a nice little family, haven't you? Wouldn't it be a pity if anything happened to break it up? And this was published in the article. The headline for this article was, quote, Detroit bandits use psychology in bank robbery, pick cashier up on street and bring him to the verge of hysteria with questions, right? So just asking some questions. They're all innocent. They're nice questions, but brought this banker to the edge of tears and got him to hand over a whole bunch of money, right? Because there were a bunch of threats which were implicit. So that's the way of the mobster, is to have these things be under the table, but very clear. And then moving on to our now former president, I just want to find 11,780 votes, which is one more than we have yet. And then he goes on and does that for a while. This is obviously in the call to the Secretary of State, Ravensburger, Georgia Secretary of State, after the election and before January 6th or 20th. You know what they did and you're not reporting it. That's a criminal offense. And, you can't let that happen. That's a big risk to you and to Ryan, your lawyer. That's a big risk. Right. So I take it that there's, and if you look at the rest of the transcript, there's a close analogy here to what's happening in example 2, right? There is, he's just pointing some things out. He's just saying some things that what he would like and some things about what could be a consequence. He's not saying you have to do this thing, but he's clearly pressuring or importuning the Secretary of State to find the votes. Okay, so those are all cases of insinuation. There's a message and an imperative to action, which is communicated, but it's not, it's off the table, it's off record. And it's designed to be that way to avoid the risk. Okay, so next class of cases I want to talk about, which are Jenny Saul has done the most to talk about, but people have been talking about a lot for relevant reasons, is the dog whistle. So the dog whistle is designed, again, there's a sort of explicit message and an implicit message. The difference with just insinuation is that there are sort of two audiences. The one audience is supposed to just take the message to be entirely innocent, and the other is supposed to have the ears to hear the coded message. So a very classic case of this is Ronald Reagan from 1980. I believe in states' rights. I believe we've distorted the balance of our government today by giving powers that were never intended to be given in the Constitution to that federal establishment. And so, okay, that's a very theoretical discussion about the setup of the, governmental structure. Really, to those who are thinking about it, it's defense of segregation, right? And other things like that. So one of the things about Trump is people like to say, the dog, Kamala Harris said, is a dog whistle through a bullhorn. One of the things about Trump is that he is not particularly implicit a lot of the time. He was happy to be extremely overt about a whole range of things, including, the kind of racism that's also in play in Reagan's speech here in 4. But he also did and does consistently deliver messages to, say, like the even further right than he, than just your garden variety white racist. So here from the his inauguration speech is, from this day forward, it's going to be only America first. For those who know, America First was, a rallying cry of a proto-fascist group from the 1930s that included Charles Lindbergh. But that's not something everybody's going to know. So it's a call out to the far right, but not something that is, so overtly, it appealed to protectionist, nativist kind of sensibilities. But below that, at a coded message, it appealed to an even more sort of extreme version of that kind of group. Okay, so those are dog whistle kinds of cases. The last is Preteritio, which is, again, you just say one thing, but you'll get something else across. But here it is precisely by conspicuous non-mention, which does the communication, right? So this is really amazing. So this is from the, I guess, the second debate with Hillary Clinton after the Access Hollywood tapes had come out. Trump says, "I'm really happy I was able to hold back on the indiscretions with respect to Bill Clinton because I had a lot of respect for Chelsea Clinton. Maybe I'll tell you at the next debate. We'll see." Right. So I'm not saying anything. I'm so proud of my restraint and not saying anything. But I'm bringing it right to your, like it's right there. It's right there, the thing that I'm not saying, right? And then just to sort of, Nancy Pelosi is a really wonderful rhetorician in her own right. And so here's a sort of, I take it a kind of analogous kind of case. It's not exactly the same, but she was asked, "What is your view about the new Green Deal?" And she said, "Oh, that will be one of several or maybe many suggestions that we receive. The Green Dream or whatever they call it. Nobody knows what it is, but they're for it, right?" And so there's a kind of generic enthusiasm, a kind of surface, approval, but she's sort of, communicating a very a dismissive attitude under the table in a way that doesn't hold her liable for that. Okay, so that's my first class. What you said was totally innocuous, but then you communicate this message that is riskier or more, that your main move is to communicate this other message, which is more insidious or risky in some way. Okay, second class of cases I want to talk about are in a way the kind of, I mean, you might think of them as a kind of inverse of this. Here they're designed, you're not really saying it. If anybody who would take you literally is really saying it, is just somebody who really can't take a joke. I mean, come on. So here you're not really saying the thing that you literally say, right? So here I'm assimilating sarcasm, bullshit, banter. There's a range of kinds of cases here. So my first case, which is, again, from Nancy Pelosi. So after Trump's State of the Union address in 2019, he called on everyone to reject the politics of revenge, resistance, and retribution and embrace the boundless potential of cooperation, compromise, and the common good. Of course, other people were the ones who were really supposed to be doing that embracing, but whatever. That's what he said. And Pelosi goes, right, so she claps at his comment there. And then people afterwards were like, "Woo, that was a clapback. That was so sarcastic. Like, look at her, like cutting down the president of the United States right there on the stage." And then she said, "Oh, it wasn't sarcastic. Look what I was applauding. I wanted him to know it was a very welcome message," right? So she was in fact being sarcastic in her clap, I take it. I think everybody kind of knew that. She was the sarcasm and communicated the message, yeah, right. You're going to embrace you're going to reject the politics of revenge and retribution yourself. And yet she can deny that that's what she was doing because, she clapped, right? I mean, and then her daughter commented, "Oh yes, that clap took me back to the teen years." She knows, and she knows that you know. And frankly, she's disappointed you thought this would work, but here's a clap, right? So, and I think that situation of she knows and she knows that you know, right? That's part of what I want to think about, and I think is distinctive. It is really palpable in all these kinds of cases. Oh, right, sorry, and then hashtag you tried it. Okay, so the next range of cases are cases of, so in all of these cases, the speaker kind of does mean what they say, but not really, and they can sort of deny that they really meant it, right? The next class is cases from, so it's just, and again, there's endless ones of these, and I've parceled them out in a sort of interesting way here between this class and the next class. But so Trump said at one point in 2018, he said, "Oh, Xi Jinping is now president for life. I think it's great. Maybe we'll have to give that a shot someday," right? And then, you know, of course, the liberal blogosphere went crazy and said he's an autocrat who wants to just stay in power by any means necessary. And then the Fox commentator said, "You people, you're so serious. How can you not take a joke? He was just joking. It's a joke. The president loves to entertain wherever he is. The so-called mainstream media don't know when to take the president figuratively, and then they take him literally for their own purposes," right? So that's a legitimate defense. There was something joking about it. On the other hand, he really kind of meant it, right? And it was a trial balloon for, you know, things that we saw more recently. Okay, the last case is a case of bullshit and banter. Those are, I think, maybe important to distinguish in other kinds of cases. But there's a case where, like, you're like, the truth value. It's not, the truth value is not the point, right? This is not spurious discourse, and yet it still accomplishes something, right? So. So I love 10 in 2016. He says, "The best taco bowls are made in Trump Tower Grill. I love Hispanics." So first of all, taco bowls, nobody really eats taco bowls. And then like that he doesn't really think he has the best taco bowls. And then like that's, I love Hispanics as a generic group. Like the whole thing, but anyway, he didn't really mean it. He's just saying something, you know. But yet he's communicating a kind of message. I mean, he's communicating a couple messages there. On the one hand, he's communicating a kind of like generic affable enthusiasm for Latino culture. So you should vote for him. On the other hand, he's actually communicating a kind of disrespect and the kind of generic sort of essentialist thinking that is an unreflective essentialist thinking that is, you know, outrageous. But it's all just kind of in good fun. It's just, you know, don't get so serious. And then the famous Access Hollywood case, the tapes, which I'm not, at this point, I'm not even going to complete the quote. But you know, and then he famously said, you're like, you know, you said what about women and what you could do to women? And then he's like, "Oh, it's just locker room banter. You people, you know, just get off it." Okay. So that's the second case. You're like, I wasn't really saying the thing that I said, and I actually was saying. Okay, then the last case, which is, I mean, there's a kind of maybe gradual transition from the cases I was just talking about to these next class of cases where it's not clear whether you're saying it or not, or what's happening. And so Al Franken, before he was disgraced, invented the term "kidding on the square" for this, or appropriated the term "kidding on the square," which I guess he says is part of a practice from you know, in the Midwest in certain kind of term you find in the Midwest in certain kinds of ways. So the kidding on the square is you're kidding, but you're not kidding. You really mean it, right? And so that's part of what's going on in these kinds of cases. So here, this one's from G.W. Bush. He says, is after re-election, he says, "Now that I've got the will of the people at my back, I'm going to start enforcing the one question rule." That was 3 questions. And so then the next reporter asks a question at a press conference. Next reporter asks a question, says, "Thank you, Mr. President. How will you go about bringing people together? Will you seek a consensus candidate for the Supreme Court if there's an opening? Will you bring some Democrats into your cabinet?" And he says, again, he violated the one question rule right off the bat. Obviously, he didn't listen to the will of the people, right? It's jocular, it's a joke, but he is enforcing the one question rule, right? And I read some analysis about the ways in which this actually was did make press conferences less challenging for Bush to actually enforce this rule, right? So it's all just, you know, he's being jocular, but it's enforcing the rule. The Russia case, the famous Trump saying, "Russia, if you're listening, I hope you'll be able to find the 30,000 emails that are missing. I think you would probably be rewarded mightily by our press," right? He says then afterwards, "I was just joking. I was being sarcastic," but you know, actually, you know, he was saying that, and there was at least the Russians took him to be serious and released a tranche of emails soon after that. Okay, and so those are the cases of like, you know, you didn't mean it, but you kind of did mean it, and you kind of can vacillate in those kinds of cases. Okay, then the next kinds of cases, and Trump says consistently about these kinds of cases, like after about the Russia case and about the next case, he says it was sarcastic, but then not that sarcastic, right? And that's something that can seem really crazy, but I think he's kind of right that is what is happening in these kind of cases. So the next case is, and he did this many times, ISIS is honoring President Obama. He founded ISIS. He is the founder in a true sense. And then the person who was interviewing him in one of these kinds of cases says, well, did you mean that Obama created a power vacuum? And he says, no, I meant he's the founder of ISIS. I do. I meant, and then later commenting, I meant exactly that. He's the founder of ISIS. And then later, still later, he says, so I said the founder of ISIS. Obviously, I'm being sarcastic. But not that sarcastic, to be honest with you. Right. So again, there's this thing, but here I think it's something about, instead of whether he means sort of the speech act as a whole, or what there's a jocularity about the force of the whole thing, it's rather something about what does it mean to be the founder? It's something about the meaning of a particular word. It's something like figurative speech that's happening here, but it's not exactly clear whether it is or not. And then the last case, which is just from, now 3 weeks ago, is from Trump's speech on January 6th. So he, many things he says, and then he says, you will never take back our country with weakness. So we're going to walk down Pennsylvania Avenue. I love Pennsylvania Avenue. So we're going to walk to the Capitol, and we're going to try to give our Republicans, not the Democrats, because they can, they're hopeless, but our Republicans, the weak ones, because the strong ones don't need any of our help. We're going to try and give them the kind of pride and boldness that they need to take back our country, right? And he also said in that speech, he says that, Republicans have to get tougher. They want to play straight, but there's been this fraud, and then fraud breaks up everything. When you catch somebody in fraud, you're allowed to go by very different rules. Giuliani talks about trial by combat, right? So there's this very strong speech about being strong, fighting, combating weakness, playing by different rules. But so the question is that incitement to sedition? Is that a call to march down and break into the Capitol and the Capitol building? And and that's clearly part of the message that is being conveyed, but that is not it's unclear whether that is in the words themselves, right? There's deniability. And so Giuliani, for instance, after saying, let's have trial by combat, he says, oh, it was a Game of Thrones reference. And if you look at the rest of the dialogue, it wasn't, clearly wasn't inciting violence. I mean, come on, who would think that, right? Okay. So I'm going to pause now and what I want to do is move on to sort of a more theoretical analysis of, what's going on in these kinds of cases, why they're powerful and effective, and how we should sort of handle them, especially as they have become more pervasive in our, especially political discourse, but also I think they are ubiquitous in private conversation. For now, I guess I'll pause and just say, there were these three big classes of non-serious, non-explicit speech that gets across a message in a way that makes it very hard to hold to account. So brief, let's just take a few minutes if anyone wants to say something. And then just Sanford, there's something also, I just had to move away. Sanford said in the chat, this is also triggering, but necessary. And there is something like at some point in the last 4 years, I just couldn't handle giving a talk with this stuff. And it's just too much. And now I think I might feel like, okay, all right, I can get, it's a little safer now. So just few questions. And if not, I'm happy to move on. Okay, I will move on. Okay, so what is going on with these? Now I'm on the second page of the handout. What is going on with these kinds of cases? What is the, why are they, how do they even work? So I take it that all of them are designed to and do afford plausible deniability, and that plausible deniability about the message you really want to convey is useful in communicating a content that is risky in some way, that you realize is risky in some way. And so what I think is, just as a diagnosis of what's happening across the board in these cases is speaker S utters a sentence X in order to communicate a meaning M. But they're prepared to deny having meant M if they're challenged, and because of the way in which M is conveyed, they can get away with that. They have plausible deniability about that meaning. Now, when they're denying that they meant M is a lie, right? Everybody knows, that she knows that that is what you meant, but it's a lie that you can get away with. As Pinker and his colleagues say, deniability need not be plausible deniability. Need not be actually plausible, only possible. And so that's sort of the thing, that's the characteristic thing, and that's the thing that we have to try to understand here. There are two features that I think, neither of which is essential, but both of which are commonly present across many of these cases. But again, you can find cases where either of these features are absent. So there are two things that are typical in this kind of speech. One is that the main move, the thing the speaker is really trying to accomplish, is peripheral rather than at issue. And that can happen through a variety of linguistic mechanisms. But often it's just because it's implicated, but it need not be that. And as a peripheral rather than at issue aspect of the discourse structure, it escapes direct response, right? If you say things like "that's not true" or "no, she's not," or if you try a sort of direct response, then it doesn't target that kind of direct response doesn't target that content. And likewise, that's a case of the more general phenomenon of this peripheral content tending to scope out of various kinds of complex constructions, including not just negation, but questions, conditionals, lots of indirect reports, though not necessarily all indirect reports. So it's hard to pin down, precisely because it's peripheral, it's hard to pin it down and take some sort of wresting to get that content to the middle of the conversational discourse. The second thing is that the content is typically amorphous. It's not clear exactly what the content is, and that makes it especially difficult to falsify. It's, what exactly is it that you're challenging and that you want to challenge, that you want to reject? And so if you try to pin any particular thing down, then the speaker can say, "Oh, I didn't mean that. I don't know why you would think I meant that." And often in these kinds of cases, and I would say this, about the generics often the amorphousness consists, at least in part, in the promulgation or evocation of a perspective, where a perspective is a kind of open-ended disposition to notice, explain, feel, and respond to a domain in an intuitive, holistic way. So you're evoking a sort of, a whole general way of thinking, a whole mode of interpretation. You know what I'm talking about, but it's not a perspective sort of in its nature, because it's not a particular proposition, is not the kind of thing that you can articulate in a certain one sentence and sort of verify or falsify. Okay, so amorphousness and peripherality are two distinct, common features that make it especially difficult to get these things to account. So, okay, so that's a sort of just, I think, a kind of diagnostic of what is, I think, often going on, why these things are so difficult to respond to. So then the question is, why does it work, right? Given how palpably implausible, it's obvious that the speaker, it's obvious that the speaker meant something like in this ballpark. The meaning is successfully communicated. That he knows that that was what he meant. So why is it still rhetorically effective despite this deniability and despite this presence of this denial? So the lesson here, I think, is that deniability trades on what Elisabeth Fricker calls the dodgy epistemics of pragmatics, which is that getting from the utterance X to the intended meaning M requires appealing to interpretive presuppositions that are context specific and merely implicit. And so they're not right there. They have to be added, and they have to be, and they can be denied. So one reason they're rhetorically effective is that just comprehension, just for your own mind, mere comprehension produces a kind of what Arthur Danto calls seductive co-optation via an enthymematic gap. So for you as a hearer to get from X to M, you have to supply some context-sensitive implicit assumptions and chain them up in a typical Gricean manner. And that means two things. One, that means you've activated those assumptions yourself, and it means you've gone through this process, right? And so that, in a way, so that makes you cognitively complicit in that process of getting to M, of deriving and determining M, in a way you're not. You're just confronted with a sentence that explicitly states a certain content. And it also means that your very ability to recover that content demonstrates that that content is in some sense out there, right? It's something that it demonstrates that you know what they're talking about. And so in that sense, it's not just the speaker's crazy assumption, it's something other people think. Many people think this, many people are saying this. But it also means for you, so that's something that has conversational effect. It makes your very fact that you're understanding, that you have comprehended, demonstrates the social currency of the implicit and the accessibility of the implicit presuppositions that have been accessed. But it also has a similar effect on the hearer themselves, that it makes it seem more objective to them, more like something that they have gotten to for themselves. And this is a reason many people, from Jesus on, have used things like parables or whatever in order to communicate, because it shifts the interpretive burden onto the hearer and makes them take some responsibility for it. But a consequence of that is that if you any kind of comprehending response, even one that attempts to challenge or reject or block or make explicit those implicit assumptions, the intended content and the precept and the assumptions led up to it, in a way is playing the game that the speaker is already on the speaker's turf, right? Is already playing that game, in sort of indulging that manner of thinking. And that is often at least part of the goal, right? So you're playing on their turf now, and that can be a risky business to engage in. Okay, so that's, I think, part of why we get this rhetorical effectiveness, even for resistant hearers, people who want to reject and deeply want to reject the communicated content. Why does it succeed? So that's a rhetorical effectiveness. Why is it? It's sort of how can it work? Here, I think what's happening is that denial is trading on the gap between what's actually mutually obvious, like these assumptions are around and they've been evoked, and communication has been successful in this sort of back and forth. So it's actually mutually obvious to you what the intended meaning is, and that these presuppositions have been evoked. But the speaker refuses to acknowledge that they are in fact mutually obvious. So what I think is happening in these cases is that the denying speaker is, as Goffman says, playing to a virtual audience. So is pretending to be in a slightly different conversational context, in which slightly different presuppositions are operative, which would generate this much more legitimate meaning, that is not at all risky, or they're pretending that there's all I meant was this other thing. I'm pretending to be a slightly different person who just meant this innocuous thing. Okay, so that was why it's sort of effective. And now, why do they get away with it? And here's where I want to sort of shift into thinking about the sort of broader theoretical lessons from one strand of what's happened in the last 4 years, but has been going on for a long time. So I think what's happening is, by framing their speech in this way, the speaker is adhering to only minimal standards of conversational cooperation. So they're exploiting a general background assumption of truthfulness and trust, as Lewis says, that we're going to really cooperate in making communication work. They're working to rule. They're just meeting the minimum standard of cooperation. So Lewis says that truthfulness and trust in trying never to utter any sentences of L that are not true in L. I don't think that's true, given the pervasiveness of non-literal, non-direct, whatever speech. I think we should say that it's truthfulness and trust in trying to utter sentences whose most accessible interpretation is true and maximally relevant. And what's happening here is the intended meaning, the meaning that is palpably communicated, is in fact the meaning you would get given that general assumption of truthfulness and trust. It is the maximally relevant, though often not true, assumption in the context. And this other sort of pretended meaning that you would offer if challenged is accessible, but only with additional effort. So it's a kind of exploitation of this background assumption of truthfulness and trust in maximal cooperation. I should be mindful of time. I just want to say, I think Lewis is right that the conventions involving L do play an essential role in interpretation here. I don't think they're as direct as he argues in languages and languages, but I think that the conventions for meaning do play a role as a least common denominator in getting from and deriving the communicated meaning. And so I think they play a real part of the reason I'm interested in this kind of speech is because I think it brings out the way in which conventions really do play a role in conventions for semantic conventions for meaning really do play a role in our ordinary discourse and in our ordinary ways of holding each other to account, precisely in the ways in which they are exploited and played with and in which we respond to them. So there is this, and it's also, I think, important to see that that common assumption of truthfulness and trust is something that, and the ways, it's a deep part of the background of communication as such. And it's also, but also the apparent flouting of it in order to, communicate successfully. In particular, in these kind of accountability avoiding ways, is also extremely common feature of conversation. So I have focused on cases that I think are particularly insidious or malicious. And I've also focused on cases that are, especially for public, they're political speech, right? But I think it's important to see that this happens both in public or political speech and in individual private speech. And also happens among strangers and also among intimates. And it also happens not just for the purposes of a more powerful figure subordinating or oppressing a less powerful figure, but also for intimates to communicate messages in ways that would be more painful if they were overt. So to save face, either our own face or the face of our interlocutor. So it's it can be a way of being kind. And also this kind of accountability avoiding speech, insinuation, joking, bullshit, that also can be a way of, for people who have less power, to communicate in ways that would be too risky to do explicitly. So it's not, I think it's really, really important not to use the particular range of cases that I focused on here, although they're especially potent, to diagnose a particular kind of power structure or a particular kind of political power motivation behind them. Still, this is, it's very common, and even if it is can and often is used for beneficial purposes, it is also used for malign purposes. And even when it's used for purportedly beneficial purposes, it can still be very frustrating as a hearer to encounter this kind of accountability avoiding speech, because it's avoiding accountability in exactly the ways you want to hold people to account. So what do you do about it? Are we just passive victims of this kind of speech? Is it a kind of powerful linguistic talisman? And I want to say that's not the case, but I guess more than I would have said 4 or 5 years ago, I think that there is a real threat to the pervasiveness of this kind of mode of speech. And I think, so I want to take that threat more seriously than I think I used to. So what I want to say is our standards, our form, the usual standards we have for holding people to account for their speech. They sort of centered on two things, on words and on intentions. So on the one hand, we have holding people to account for what they say, right? And I take it that that's a matter of holding people to account for the public commitments that they undertake. On the other hand, we hold people to account for what they meant. And I take it that speaker meaning is a matter of private coordination in mutually recognized intention. So, I successfully communicate my speaker meaning if you, my intended audience, identify what I meant, if we coordinate on what my intentions were. And what the so those are our two standards for accountability, and the accountability avoiding speakers sort of threading their way through that kind of those two standards. They achieve speaker meaning without the liability of saying, right? They don't go for the kind of public commitment that is involved in saying, so they can't be held to account in that way. They succeed in coordinating their intentions. So successful, speaker meaning is successful, but the dodgy epistemics of mental ascription, like, do you really know exactly what went on in somebody else's mind? How can you prove what was going on in somebody else's mind? That widens the scope of what counts as a reasonable interpretation of an utterance, and means that you have to rule that out in order to sort of really hold somebody to account, they can always just insist. They very often can insist, "Oh, I didn't mean that. You're imputing to me something I didn't think at all." I think that there's something really right about having those two standards of accountability, and I think there's something really right about our legal and other public forms of liability. You can't hold, I mean, so both our conversational practices of holding people liable and our public and especially legal practices of holding somebody liable for what they meant depends on what any reasonable hearer would have taken any reasonable speaker to have meant in that context. That's a high burden of evidence, a high bar of evidence to meet. And I think it's right that that's a high bar of evidence to meet, but that's the bar that's in place, for instance, in workplace harassment law, right? You have to show that any reasonable hearer would have taken this to be a threat or a case of harassment or, a case of blackmail. Similarly, for incitement, right? Now, so it doesn't, the law does not require that it be in the words, right? That the thing, or else, you'd never be able to hold a mobster accountable for, it'd be too easy for the mobsters to get off their implicit threats. On the other hand, it does, cases of bribery, blackmail, harassment, the legal standards do involve what any reasonable hearer in that context would have taken it to be, right? And that is exactly what a really good accountability avoiding speaker avoids, right? They stay just under that bar so that it is deniable, it is plausibly deniable, right? So there is some reasonable interpretation on which they could have meant something innocent. So I think that is right, that the standard for holding people liable, it should be kind of high, but it's very frustrating. And it's especially frustrating in this kind of context where people are saying this kind of stuff. And it is, in fact, stuff with, incredibly powerful and I'm not gonna get all histrionic, but damaging consequences. So 2 lessons of the last 4 years, which are sort of caveats or push against what I just was saying. So I think it's right that there are these forms of liability are centered on words and intentions, and centering on intentions sort of makes it very hard to hold people accountable for this kind of speech. But 2 lessons from what's been happening in the last 4 years and was always happening already. One is there's this really important sense in which intentions shouldn't matter and don't matter, right? It doesn't matter what you're actually trying to do. What matters is what you actually did. And it's not just what you actually said, right? It's what the effect and the known foreseeable effect on the conversation more broadly would be. So this debate about, was Trump lying, or is he just that deluded? That's in some sense, again, a fool's game. And there's a way in which that is a distraction. And we have a notion of meaning which is designed to not care that much about intentions. And that's the notion of common ground meaning, which is a matter of, performed coordination among mutually acknowledged assumptions, right? It's ways in which it doesn't matter what I actually think, it matters how I act as if I think in this context, right? And that is something that is not a matter of private intentions, it's a matter of my behavior. I think the problem is that we don't have mechanisms designed to operate around that kind of meaning. And that's something that I think, I would like to think more about. The second thing is that once this kind of, I've emphasized that, this kind of exploitation of truthfulness and trust is much more common than just a few bad people doing very bad things, and that it need not be malicious. But the more pervasive it becomes, the more it erodes the possibility of coordination at all, right? And ultimately that includes, there has to be some kind of assumption of truthfulness and trust in order for communication to succeed. And to the extent that that is eroded, then that does threaten to undermine the possibility of communication, including the possibility of semantic conventions, right? What even is being strong or fighting or, so what do we do about this sorry situation that we're all in, or that we individually find ourselves in upon occasion when somebody engages in accountability avoiding speech and we want to combat it? The important first thing, which lots of people have noted, is that silence is often tantamount to acquiescence, right? So if you don't say something, then you allow these presuppositions to enter the common ground and eventually the wider public sphere in a way that is deeply pernicious. So you got to do something. But as we saw, a direct challenge, including a challenge which explicitates, implicit assumptions, is very difficult, often impotent, might be worse, might be legitimating. So that's a risky thing to do. So the thing that I've been saying is that this kind of accountability avoiding speech, it involves a kind of communicative bluff. The speaker is attempting to shift interpretive burden and responsibility away from themselves onto the hearer. And you do the work of recovering, identifying this meaning and covering up and making it explicit and rejecting it. I'm just doing this little innocuous thing, right? So there is a counter, if that's the communicative bluff, which is trying to shift this interpretive burden. There is a correlative weapon, which is pedantry, right? So pedantry calls that bluff by refusing to sort of do that work, right? So I take it there are two kinds of pedantry. One, the kind favored by philosophers, is flat-footed pedantry and just insists on what is said, right? Just insists on, what did you say? I'm sorry, I didn't understand. Could you just say that again? And are you assuming something that would make that relevant to the conversation? We're all very practiced with that. The other is cunning pedantry, which is sort of taking, so there's a gap between what was said and what was intended to be communicated. Well, the speaker wanted you to fill that in a certain way, a certain train of assumptions and associations, inferences. Well, you just drive that train to a different station, right? You invoke other implicit assumptions in order to derive your own preferred meaning. So an example from the last session, you might say, oh yes, indeed, women are submissive. Well, let's just, that's because, right? So sort of twisting what's implicit in the meaning to your own ends. Now, successfully doing that is going to depend on being fast on your feet, being sensitive to the sociodynamics of the conversation, often being sort of witty. So there's a lot of, that's a difficult thing to do. Often, again, not always, but often part of what it's going to be important to do is to use, if the speaker is trying to evoke, and part of the reason that speech is powerful is because they're evoking an unarticulated perspective, then it's going to be wise to evoke an alternative perspective or to play with that perspective. So not just try to identify a particular assumption that you can challenge, but rather to sort of either appropriate the kind of way of thinking that the speaker is aiming for, but to twist it to your own ends at a broader cognitive level, or to offer an alternative, so either appropriation or alternation, just offer a really different kind of perspective. So there you are harnessing exactly the kind of intuitive, implicit, partly automatic, encompassing, emotionally laden, imagistically evocative kind of patterns of thinking that the speaker is evoking, is trading on. You're doing that for yourself, right? You're not just going back to clean logic. But so I've emphasized in the past that achieving sort of the kind of cutting pedantry and reframing requires wit and imagination. But the other thing is that really I don't know what to do about, and I think it's true, and it's become truer to me over the more palpable to me, is that any form of accountability, whether it's this sort of, cunning twisting or the flat-footed literalism, or just other kinds of calling out, anything that you do in response requires holding to account, requires some kind of, accountability just is a form of acknowledgement, right? It's getting the speaker to acknowledge what they were up to and holding them to account for what they were really up to, or at least if they won't acknowledge it, getting other people to acknowledge that that's what they were up to. And these are ways of gaining, I've just offered some ways of gaining traction when the particular utterance as framed avoided that kind of traction, that kind of accountability. But those are only ways of driving back the gears of conversation to a more fundamental level. And it's always in principle up to the interlocutor to refuse to engage, to refuse to give that traction and just insist, oh, I don't know what my words don't mean what your words, you take your words to mean. I don't hear that implication. I don't, right? So achieving accountability does require at some point a more basic culture of truthfulness and trust, and where that includes some kind of agreement on semantic conventions for what words mean. And that is not something that is guaranteed. That is not something that is a given. And that is something that, really can appear fragile. And on that cheery note, I will end with just a few minutes for conversation.
Thank you very much, Liz. That was wonderful, super rich talk. So it's plenty of discussion. So I think I suggest we kind of slowly move into the break, and then we'll shift the next talk, given that we have very limited time for comments and questions. So please, Robin.
Liz, hi. Beautiful talk. I think I liked everything that you said, and I think that I agreed with almost everything that you said, but I wanted to ask one question about something that seemed to me to be that you placed more weight on in previous work, that you seem to me now to be revealing why it maybe is less important, and that's the role of the at-issue content. And so many of your examples are just examples where like the at-issue content is horrible, but it can be implausibly denied. But on your analysis, there's this possibility for deniability. So Trumpkin said, all Mexicans are rapists.
Right.
And like that at-issue content is horrible, but he could, of course, just employ I was joking, but whatever it is.
Right.
So I was wondering whether or not you need that.
Yeah. So so one of the things that I've been interested in the past is so in the past, I've like with talking about insinuation or whatever, I've wanted to show that there are these antagonistic relationships, and then there's this kind of tussle that happens, and there's this there's the kind of denial, and then there's the kind of pushback that hearers can do. And so to really make that dramatic, I focused on cases of insinuation, where it's clearly like there's this big gulf, right? And then I've thought about ways in which that can like infect, especially, so I think figurative meaning is closer to its word meaning, but contextual word meaning, and then it can infect like, stuff that's really undeniably part of the semantic issue content, right? It's indeterminate exactly what is in the semantic content. I am interested in ways in which the options for deniability and for pedantry sort of shift as you shift across that trajectory from like really marginal communicated speech to like fully at issue communicated meaning. So I don't think they're all on a par. I think they vary in interesting ways. And I think that shows us, again, something about the relation between semantics and pragmatics, and it's the status of semantics in ordinary conversational discourse. So in that sense, I do think it matters, right? These cases are not all the same, because I think the differences between really super pragmatic-y cases and the really super semantic-y cases reveals something about the changing standards. But it is important. So part of me has just been not wanting to fight the battle about the semantics in the past, and because I wanted to make this other point. But you're right. Partly I'm just like, well, this looks like the same damn thing, you know, and it really feels so. So it has been borne in on me, you know, that the continuity and the among these cases, and the ways and yeah. So you're right.
Thank you.
But I don't give up the distinction. Yeah. So some people would say, oh, therefore all contextualism or whatever. And I would say, no, you know,
Right.
precisely to the contrary.
It provides you some resources, but the emphasis that you've got is on the other stuff. Thank you.
Can I just call on David?
Yeah, David.
We only have a few minutes here. Can we just like, you know? Hey, David.
Hi. Thank you so much for the talk. Really, really fun and insightful. And the Kamala Harris quote, by the way, is in the title. It's only TBA, but it's in the title that Jason and I have for tomorrow, and a talk that Robin heard us give yesterday, a version of. Just quickly, the material that you're looking at here is very similar issues to some of the issues that Jason and I have been looking at. But one thing we focus on a lot is group dynamics.
Yeah.
And you didn't mention it. The word, I think, sociodynamics came up at some point, but you didn't mention groups and different audiences at any point. And you used concepts, you invoked, like briefly in describing how one might go about analyzing in more detail. You use concepts like common ground, meaning, which seems to suggest just an extension of the like business as usual, one audience with common ground commitments in that common ground that we can all agree on. So does the fact that you didn't mention groups imply that the phenomena you looked at can be analyzed without reference to groups and power relations between groups? Is that a question that makes sense?
Yes. No. And I think one way of thinking about this, I mean, this is certainly best sort of in my mind, as I've been revisiting these issues. One way of thinking about this is that I want to give you and Jason or your ilk sort of more space than I think has been given previously, but not take over the whole domain. And so I want to say it all matters, right? Public record meaning matters. Conventional meaning matters. Gricean meanings, like speakers meaning matters, but also group, you know, sort of meaning that as that is enacted by in a group way in virtue of group assumptions also matters. And part of what I'm thinking about is, and that's what's so frustrating, is we are, I think, should be thinking more concretely about developing mechanisms for holding to account that kind of the way in which you can make achieve intended effects at a group level. The intended effect is a group level effect, and you can achieve that effect, but precisely in ways that escape our usual standards of accountability, because our usual standards of accountability are designed to address either public record meaning or sort of private, you know, Gricean meaning. So I want to say there's good reasons why our standards for accountability have this kind of like these two sort of entirely private and entirely public kind of status. The sort of sociodynamic group stuff is in the middle. That's important theoretically that it's different. It's also super important, like tangibly, socially, right, with the kind of politically. And we need to figure out what to do about that. but I also don't think that that's, I mean, I think that, so I'm sorry for everybody else. I think, David, that I was speaking in terms that like you can hear what I'm saying. I think what I said was coherent, but I know that it went by really fast, what I just said.
Yeah.
And I might not be super
agree
tracking.
Sure. And I agree with the thrust of it. I don't think that would be controversial for me. I won't ask another question because I'm sure there's other questions, but I'll just remark, I wondered in particular whether for many of the cases, not all, I've wondered what dodgy epistemics even means as I've tried to work through it myself over the last few years. And I've wondered whether group dynamics for many of these cases, not necessarily in every threat, but in many of the cases, whether the complication added by multiple audiences contributes in a significant way to the dodginess of the epistemics. But I'll leave it there. And
no, I think that's right. I have to say something more, which is just, I think that there is this like, so I really like the idea, and maybe this is just to say, not just like, oh yeah, I should do more like thinking like you guys do, but rather, I really like the idea from Goffman about like persona and playing a role in a conversation. And there's a way in which I think for lots and lots of different aspects of my own theoretical thinking, including thinking about philosophy of mind and whatever, I think that the persona is primary and the like actual person is secondary. And so there's this, and I think that's really true of Trump. Like does he mean it? It doesn't mean, I mean, there's a persona and he inhabits these different, you know, and so in a way, the persona is the thing that really matters. And we perform these, and that is a social construction. That is something in the group. And so it's not that that doesn't involve epistemics, like we're inferring to what personas, you know, what persona he might be playing, and we're inferring to what that persona would think and respond in certain kinds of ways. But it is really different than thinking about a particular person sort of having particular actual intentions.
Thank you.
There's a lot more to say. I'd love to get back to talking with you, but I think we dropped this ball, you know, whatever, I feel bad.
We can continue on the open discussion. So we have Rob, Alexander, and Alessandra. So hopefully we can kind of wrap up until like 40 minutes or 20 minutes to 7. So let's go. Rob, you were first.
Should Alexander go first if he's not asked a question in the session yet?
Quick negotiation.
I don't know. I don't know. I don't care, but I can ask a question. I'm happy to. So yeah, I was wondering. So I'm still have difficulties like squaring these two ideas. That on the one hand, there's mutual knowledge about what the speaker meant on the one hand, and on the other hand, that the speaker somehow still gets away with it. Like, if you think of it like in this terms of knowledge action debates or stuff, most people would want to say, okay, knowledge suffices for actionability. So in these cases, it should suffice, for instance, to blame people. It should suffice to call them out. It should suffice to resist, you know, these pretense attempts to not get stuff in the common ground and so on and so forth. So I was wondering, how you see that. If you think that in these cases, holding somebody accountable might require more than knowledge, or if you think, maybe it's not really knowledge after all, or what do you think there?
So I guess I think that this kind of phenomenon is common enough that it should call into question. So I think for all intents and purposes, this really is a case of mutual knowledge. You know, it is, for all intents and purposes, it is a case of mutual knowledge. And if that's a problem for your analysis of mutual knowledge, then you should work on revising your notion. So, but there are different ways you can go here. So you could say something like, okay, maybe we don't have, you know, recognition infinitely iterated, you know, acknowledgement. But look, if you're going that way, then mutual knowledge is going to be much rarer than we take it to be, right? So I don't think that's really the way to go. You can say for all intents and purposes, I mean, I don't think these cases differ in any substantive interesting way from other cases that we're happy to call mutual knowledge, except that there's this crazy, tricky thing going on, right? And this is just a phenomenon. Like so I had a conversation where, like, this was, you know, many, many years ago now. I had a conversation with Christina Bicchieri about this, and I was like, look, this seems really crazy. Like, these aren't, like, looks like you don't get full iteration. Like, can I call these coordination about, like, you know, does Lewis game machinery come in? I get this seems, and she was like, well, it's just not possible. These cases couldn't exist. I was like, but they do, you know, so like, so I think I should just leave it at that. So I have other things to think about, but I just like for practical purposes, these are cases of knowledge, and you know, and if not, then let's just we need to back off in general, you know, and we need a weaker notion, and we can do that.
Okay, Rob or Alexandra?
I'll jump in. Thanks very much for the paper. I kind of just wanted to press a little bit on the suggestions right at the end, the realpolitik of the paper that happened in the closing section. I guess I find myself skeptical about the thought that cunning pedantry can be an effective way of responding to this kind of accountability avoidance speech that you're describing. Part of my skepticism just owes to the fact that there's a huge amount of cunning pedantry out there, you know, social media, many of the, you know,
exactly.
And you know, all the kind of the late night comedy shows like Samantha Bee, you know, this is what they do, and they do it really well. And even it seems to almost exist in a symbiotic relationship at times with the very speech that it's supposing to contend with. So what I was wondering you might have up your sleeve is some thought that goes in the direction of saying that even if it does at moments have that symbiotic relationship with the speech it's responding to, that in other ways, cunning pedantry has the capacity to help cultivate a culture of trust and truthfulness. Because you say right at the end, none of this is going to work in the absence of those kind of background cultural norms, and that seems very plausible. I was wondering whether you thought maybe cunning pedantry is a way of establishing such a culture.
Good. Okay. So yeah, this is one of the things that happened to me was I was going back to like the talk that the version, the handout I had from like February 2017, and it just seems so like quaintly, earnestly hopeful about the possibility of, like, I called it earnest pedantry, and I had this nice quote from Mara Liasson about, you know, electoral fraud, right? And it being like nicely pedantic, you know. And then I had an example of snarky reframing and the way that was, you know. And then I was like, oh, we thought that was going to do something, you know. So one thing to just emphasize is, again, I'm talking about a broader phenomenon, which I think cunning pedantry does work, especially if you're targeting a particular person who you're actually having a conversation with, as opposed to, you know, that's one thing. The second thing is, yeah, I think there's a lot of really wonderful cunning pedantry involved in late night, whatever, but that's not at the right audience, right? There are multiple audiences that you might be thinking about. I mean, it's just making me feel better if I watch it. It's not making, you know, I'm not the target audience, right? So the question is, I do think that, so it has to be, so the question is, who are you trying to engage, and who are you trying to get to have the acknowledgement that that's not present, right? One is the speaker themselves, and that might be a lost cause or might not be a lost cause. Another, and it might be, but you might be having a conversation with an individual and trying to get them to acknowledge, right? And then cunning pedantry might be a useful thing, or it might not be, it depends. Another thing is their sympathetic audience, right? Who is not you, but, you know, and there, I have some more hope, but it's going to be different. The kind of cutting and the kind of, you know, the way in which you're going to exploit what is actually said and rope it in for your own conclusions is going to differ than if you were trying to convince either somebody who's already on your own team or somebody who's on the other, you know, the speaker themselves, right? You're going to have to call on different tropes, different sort of gut reactions, different susceptibilities to shame, you know, like that's, you know, so what can you, and there are so many times when I thought, certainly they'll hear now, right? Certainly they'll see and they'll respond and they'll, you know, but you need to get traction somehow. And that's something that, and that's part of why this, so I do think that cunning pedantry can be a kind of, both in the kind of like a kind of snarky way, but also in a kind of earnest way, right? Appropriating terms like, so I had an example. George W. Bush had on his website, you know, I'm not a great fan of George W. Bush, but had a thing about, like, you know, really talking about growth and prosperity, right? And so appropriating all that language of growth and prosperity and American, you know, the American economy, and then bringing in immigrants as a supporter, as a factor in supporting that. Right. So that's an example of sort of, yeah, I totally agree with America first. Let's really get America first. And in order to do that, we've got to allow in a bunch, you know. So that might be a kind of case that I'm thinking about. Again, if it works, I don't know if everybody's super tribalized so they can't hear anything, but that is a way in which I think it can help to bridge gaps, and none of it's guaranteed, and we're in a very sorry state and everything sucks, but those might be tools that might be better than some other tools.
Great. So we have a final question from Alessandra, and then I will suggest, we try to start with Sandy's talk by 45 minutes. Oh, wait,
and I apologize, Sandy, for
5 minutes. So, Alessandra, quickly.
I'm interested. I don't know what you think about this case. So it seems to me, a whole family of cases that involve plausible deniability, but don't work through this mechanism of seduction. So what I'm thinking of is the art of throwing shades. So the art of throwing shades, which is very common in the gay community, and I think also in the working class Latino community, is a sort of way of insulting people, is an art form, and it mostly works when sophisticated through this sort of plausible deniability. But it does not seem to involve any seductive co-option, as far as I can tell. It is a very, very skillful way of putting people down, and it requires the person to understand that they're being put down, rather than having this sort of quasi, the seductive co-option. It seems to be slightly different to me, so I was wondering what you thought of it.
So, so I love this question, and it's a great thing to think more about. One thing, and it would depend on the particular nuances of the different communities and the way they're working, right? So there's a kind of, I take it that the phenomenon you're talking about is different from playing the dozens or whatever different. So there are cultures, especially African-American cultures, of ritualized insults, public insulting, which are joking, but, effective, and where it doesn't have really anything to do with the particular details of the person being targeted, right? So, your mom is so fat that blah, 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 or, that doesn't even matter. You don't even have to know anything about. So that doesn't have traffic in any super highly specific contextual assumptions, right? I think that's not what you're talking about. You're talking about cases that are more nuanced and more targeted at the particular audience.
Something like, I love your shoes.
Right, yeah. So I think that those, so I guess I would deny that those don't involve, so there's a question about how rich you want to take the term seductive cooptation to mean. So I take it that those still involve the kind of thing I'm talking about, which is, and I think this is a lot of what's happening with sarcasm and why people often, and irony, and why people often turn to it, is you're evoking what somebody would say if they were going to be really you're evoking a standard, a normative standard, and a kind of why this would be a violation of it, and and those are all, I don't want to say public because for the reasons of the interchange between me and David, but they're social. Those are all assumptions with social currency and with some power in the context, right? And so to the extent that those are being evoked, and sort of the speaker is throwing that up as and I challenge you to deny that is an appropriate standard, right? That is the same kind of process that I'm talking about. So you're evoking an implicit assumption that you are demonstrating to have a kind of social currency, and forcing this hearer to engage that and acknowledge that assumption, just in order to sort of see what the speech was up to. So I do think that they involve, I think it does feel different. So I started using the term seductive cooptation from Danto in the context of thinking about metaphorical insults, which is where you're really sort of like the path from literal to the metaphorical is really depends upon highly contingent assumptions. I think it's a little bit different in this kind of case, but I still think it has the same kind of feel. So maybe you're hearing something in seductive cooptation that's richer and stronger than what I'm hearing or intending. But to me, they still feel like they have the kind of.
No, it could be. It could very well be.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. I have overstayed my welcome already, so let us.
That's perfect timing. So thank you again, Liz. That was wonderful.